What if I told you that the difference between the person who dies forgotten and the person whose name echoes for centuries has almost nothing to do with talent? What if greatness isn't handed out at birth, but built brick by brick in the smallest, most unglamorous moments of a single ordinary day? A blind boy who cannot see the page in front of him becomes one of the greatest historians who ever lived. A boy who stutters through his first speech in Parliament grows into the most feared voice in the House of Commons. A poor tinker, thrown into a filthy jail cell, writes a book so powerful it will still be read 300 years later in nearly every language on earth. What do they know that we don't? Stay with me to the end of this video, because by the time we're done, you're going to understand the actual mechanics of achievement. And you may never look at a failure or an obstacle in your life the same way again. Back in 1898, a writer named Orison Swett Marden sat down to compile a book unlike most success manuals of his day. He didn't want to just tell people to work hard. He wanted to show them, through hundreds of true stories, of Lincoln and Washington, of Michelangelo and Florence Nightingale, of blacksmiths and blind scholars and forgotten schoolgirls, exactly what separates a wasted life from an achieved one. He called it the secret of achievement. And his core argument was this: the highest achievement isn't wealth and it isn't fame. It's character. Everything else is just decoration. This book became one of the most beloved success guides of its era, packed with portraits of the eminent persons of the 19th century and stitched together with poetry, proverbs, and Marden's own relentless, old-fashioned conviction that any person, however humble their beginnings, could rise. Today, I'm going to walk you through the entire book, chapter by chapter, story by story. So settle in. This is going to be a journey through some of the most remarkable true stories of grit, cheerfulness, honesty, and purpose ever collected in one place. Let's begin where Marden begins, with something you might not expect from a book about achievement. He begins with sunshine. Marden opens by declaring that there is no real life but a cheerful life. He tells the story of a farm boy who asks his father what an optimist is. The father can't give a dictionary definition, but he remembers his own brother Henry, a boy who could make hoeing corn under a blazing sun feel like a game, who turned picking stones out of a rocky field into a treasure hunt for nuggets. Henry wasn't fooling himself about the hard work in front of him. He was simply choosing to meet it with a light heart, and that lightness made the work bearable, even joyful, for everyone around him. Marden fills this chapter with examples of people who chose sunshine over gloom. There's Charles Dana, the newspaper editor, who worked at his office every single day, even through his final illness, and who told a cabinet officer who pitted him for his grueling job, "Grind? You never were more mistaken. I have nothing but fun." There's a story of David Coombe, an old English cobbler working in the darkest, dingiest little shop imaginable, who dreams that an angel tells him how to trap a sunbeam. The bait is energy, perseverance, industry, charity, faith, hope, and contentment. So Coombe does the simplest thing imaginable. He cleans the dust off his windows, and the sunbeams come pouring in, a whole family of them, and they come to stay. Marden insists that anxiety ruins work, that fretting and hurrying accomplish less than calm, steady effort. He quotes Carlyle's plea, "Give us the man who sings at his work, because that man does more, does it better, and perseveres longer." He tells us that a merry heart is a medicine, that laughter genuinely exercises internal organs, sets the blood moving, and restores the very balance we call health. He recounts how Abraham Lincoln kept a book of humor in the corner of his desk, and when fatigued or depressed, would read a chapter from it for relief, calling humor his life preserver. And he warns us, too, about the opposite. The bright, cheerful man creates a cheerful world around him wherever he goes. But the fretful, sarcastic, gloomy man carries a cloud with him into every room he enters, and people flinch from him without even knowing why. We get back from the world roughly what we give it if we go through life radiating warmth. The world tends to warm itself around us if we go through it radiating gloom. Don't be surprised when gloom answers back. The chapter closes with a simple, defiant creed. Don't save your smiles for some future day or some more deserving person. Scatter your flowers as you go. You will never travel this road again. From sunshine, Marden turns to something much less glamorous, drudgery, and he opens with a blessing on it that might surprise you. Blessed be drudgery. He tells the story of a boy named Charles, tired of school, who tells his father he sees no point in studying further, since his friend George's wealthy father lets George stay home. The father takes Charles, the very next morning, to visit a prison, where an old schoolmate of the father's, now a convict, explains that his ruin came from idleness. He inherited wealth, never learned an honest trade, and when the money vanished, he had no way to earn a living. So he turned to crime. Charles goes home and decides, quietly, to return to school. There's also young John Adams, future president, who asks his father to be excused from studying Latin grammar. His father agrees on the condition that John spend the day digging ditches in the bog instead. After one exhausting day with the spade, John begs to return to his Latin books the very next morning. Marden hammers home, again and again, that nearly every great achievement in history was built not on flashes of inspired genius, but on unglamorous, repetitive, grinding labor. Michelangelo worked with such controlled fury on marble that witnesses feared he'd shatter the stone entirely. Yet in a material where one wrong stroke meant total ruin, he never made that mistake because he had trained himself through years of unseen practice. He made his own tools. He studied human anatomy for 12 years, nearly ruining his health, simply to master his craft. Great writers, too, are shown here as tireless laborers rather than mystical geniuses. Plato rewrote the opening sentence of The Republic 9 different ways before he was satisfied. Gibbon rewrote the first chapter of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire 3 times, and it took him nearly 25 years to complete the whole work. Bryan is said to have rewritten his poem Thanatopsis 100 times and still felt dissatisfied. This, Marden argues, is what separates true accomplishment from the shallow work of holiday writers who imagine that genius alone, without labor, can produce anything lasting. He even takes us to Russia, where Peter the Great, heir to an empire, chose instead to travel incognito and work as a common laborer in shipyards and forges across Europe, refusing special payment, insisting on being treated exactly like any other workman, so that he could bring real skills home to modernize his backward country. The chapter ends with the sobering truth that nature has no patience for the idle. In old England, idleness itself was once punished by law, with escalating severity, up to and including death for repeat offenders. Nothing in the universe outside of man sits idle, Marden says. Everything is at work fulfilling its purpose. And the moment we stop using our own faculties, they begin, slowly and surely, to decay. Next, Marden turns to honesty, both as a moral principle and, quite bluntly, as smart policy. He opens with young Abdel Kader, sent out by his mother with money sewn into his clothing and a solemn promise never to lie. When robbers demand his money, he tells them plainly where it's hidden, expecting to lose it, refusing to lie even to save himself. The robber chief, stunned by this loyalty to a promise made to his mother, is so moved that the entire band abandons its life of crime on the spot. There's a story of A.T. Stewart, the great dry goods merchant, who fired a salesman on the spot, in front of a customer, the very moment the young man was caught praising merchandise he had privately admitted was inferior. Stewart built an empire on the simple, radical premise that the truth would always be told over his counters, no matter the cost. Marden is scathing about the small compromises so many businesses accept as normal: adulterated milk, watered goods, false advertising. It includes actual letters intercepted by health boards showing merchants selling chemicals specifically to help milkmen dilute their product without detection. Against this, he sets men like the Maine farmer who shipped his very best apples, with his name and an invitation to write him honestly about their quality, and build a booming export business purely on trust. He tells the story of Abraham Lincoln walking 6 miles after dark to return a few cents of overcharged change to a poor woman rather than wait until morning. He recounts how, as a young lawyer, Lincoln refused to argue a case once he learned his own client had deceived him about the justice of his cause, even though his law partner went on to win the case in a large fee, half of which Lincoln refused to touch. There's George Jones, editor of the New York Times, offered $5 million by the corrupt Tweed Ring to simply stay quiet and let the fraud continue. His answer: "I don't think the devil will ever make a higher bid for me than that." He published the evidence anyway, and the corrupt machine collapsed. Marden closes this chapter reminding us that honesty isn't just about grand refusals of bribery. It's found in the smallest daily transactions: giving full measure, admitting a fault, refusing to keep a coin a shopkeeper mistakenly returned. Character, he insists, is worth more than capital, because capital can be lost overnight, but name for honesty, once earned, opens doors that money alone never could. Now we come to one of Marden's favorite subjects: habit, the force he calls both our servant and our master. He begins with an unforgettable image. Imagine the Mississippi River at its mouth. You could never separate out, drop by drop, which particles of water came from the Red River, the Missouri, or the Ohio. In just the same way, once a lifetime of small habitual acts has poured itself into a character, it becomes utterly impossible to untangle one thread from another. Character is the river. Habits are the streams that feed it. He tells us that we sow an act and reap a habit. We sow a habit and reap character, and warns that while good habits require conscious effort to build, bad ones, like weeds, spring up entirely on their own, unaided and untrained. He shares the story of a blind man who, after an operation restored his sight, was actually more afraid walking the streets seeing them than he ever was navigating them blind, because his instincts, built on darkness, hadn't yet adjusted to light. Marden describes habit almost as physiology. Each time we perform a right action, he explains, we wear a smoother path through our own nerve and brain tissue, making that same right action easier to repeat next time. And each time we give in to a wrong impulse, we wear a different path, making that wrong action easier too. Over years, one of those paths becomes a superhighway, and the other overgrows completely. This is why an honest man is astonished when he's later revealed to be a habitual small deceiver. The little compromises had already worn deep a path he never noticed forming. He includes the story of a reformed drunkard a temperance lecturer who had been sober and respected for years. Undone in a single moment when the smell of brandy from a broken decanter he was repairing awoke the old craving instantly. Proof that a habit, even after being conquered for years, is never entirely erased, only kept at bay through constant vigilance. And he closes with real hope, too. Just as a crooked tree can slowly, patiently, be trained straight over years by careful staking and bending, a crooked habit can be straightened, though never in a single triumphant moment of willpower. It takes the same slow, repeated effort that built the bad habit in the first place, redirected toward the good. Marden's 5th chapter zooms in on something almost nobody thinks matters: trifles, the tiny, seemingly meaningless details of daily life. He opens with a story about a bookkeeper who spent 3 sleepless weeks trying to find a $900 discrepancy in his accounts, nearly driving himself to a breakdown, before discovering the culprit was a squash fly whose leg had turned a 0 into a 9 in the ledger. He tells us that the Crimean War, one of history's bloodiest conflicts, technically began over a dispute about who held the key to a shrine. A single glass of wine too many caused the death of a French duke, which changed the succession of an entire dynasty. Roland Hill's entire system of cheap postage, a reform that transformed communication across the world, was inspired by watching a poor woman refuse a letter because she couldn't afford the postage, and realizing the letter contained no message at all, just prearranged marks on the envelope she and her brother used to signal that they were both well. Marden is fascinated by how enormous consequences hang on the smallest hinges. The New York Fire Department, he notes, train its men to have their boots and trousers arranged in precisely the same spot beside every bed, purely to save a fraction of a second when sliding down the pole to answer an alarm. A missing comma in a piece of legislation once cost the government $1 million. An office boy's 2-cent shortfall in postage on a legal summons triggered hours of courtroom argument and $30 in costs. He also shows us the flip side, how small kindnesses ripple outward in ways we can't predict. A girl who, as a child, brought a lonely prisoner a book to read at his request, kept her promise on his deathbed to help his fellow prisoners too, and went on to found prison libraries across the United States. A little girl who taught herself to say, "Yes, dear," instead of a curt reply transformed the emotional tone of her entire household. He tells us that Columbus himself, on the verge of turning back, held his crew together purely by pointing to a string of small, trifling observations: changed cloud colors, a floating branch with fresh berries, shifting winds, and building them into a confident argument that land was near. Trifles gave him hope, and hope gave him the new world. The lesson of this chapter is blunt. Genius, Charles Dickens once said, is simply a being who pays attention to trifles. Grand temples are built from small stones, and a great life, in the end, is really just a long, patient accumulation of a great many small, faithful, trifling acts. If you're finding value in these stories so far, this is a great moment to hit that subscribe button, because we still got 10 more chapters of remarkable, true history ahead of us, and you won't want to miss where this book goes next. Chapter 6 turns to obstacles, and Marden opens with a vivid image from Bulwer's fiction: a tree growing crooked, twisted, and struggling in a crack of solid rock, forced to fight at every turn, simply to reach the sunlight. And yet, precisely because of that endless struggle, its leaves grow every bit as green and healthy as those of a vine that never had to fight for anything at all. He tells the extraordinary story of William H. Prescott, the historian, who lost the sight in one eye from a piece of thrown bread in college, and then, shortly after, nearly lost the use of his remaining eye to inflammation, forcing him to spend weeks at a time pacing a completely darkened room. Rather than abandon his ambitions, Prescott trained his memory to hold and revise up to 60 pages of material at a time in his head, dictating it later to an assistant, and went on to write some of the greatest historical works of the century, including his history of Ferdinand and Isabella and his account of the conquest of Mexico and Peru. He tells us about an astonishing list of accomplished blind individuals. Thomas Blacklock, blind from 3 months old, became one of the most learned men of a century. Francis Huber, blind early in life, became a renowned expert on the behavior of bees. Nicholas Sanderson, blind from age 3, mastered astronomy and mathematics. John Metcalfe, blind at 6, became England's most expert violinist by age 12. Milton wrote his greatest works after losing his sight, poor and sick, declaring that whoever can suffer best can also do best. Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress, arguably the most widely translated book in history outside of Scripture, while sitting in Bedford jail, a poor, uneducated tinker mocked by university scholars, who had no idea, as he wrote, what an enormous impact his book would eventually have. Marden reminds us, again and again, that helps do not make men, obstacles do. He shares Governor Seymour of New York's remarkable reflection late in life, that if he could erase 20 mistakes from his past, he would not erase his failures or his sorrows, because those were precisely the experiences that shaped him. What he'd want to erase, if anything, were his easy triumphs, because those had taught him nothing. It cannot be repeated too often, Marden insists. It is not comfort but conflict that makes character. From obstacles, we move naturally into Chapter 7, which is devoted entirely to courage. Marden opens with a wounded officer under Wellington, told by his doctor he has only months to live from consumption. His response, then he may as well die fighting as die in bed. He returns to his regiment, fights at Waterloo, and the very wound he receives there actually removes the diseased portion of his lung, and he lives for years afterward. We meet Charles XII of Sweden, calmly continuing to dictate a letter even as an enemy bomb crashes through the roof and lands in his very chamber, simply asking his secretary, whose hand is trembling, what has the bomb to do with the subject of the letter? Right on. There's young Lieutenant Delafosse at Comper, who throws himself bodily beneath a burning, ammunition-laden cart under direct enemy fire. Tear away the flaming wood with his bare hands to prevent a catastrophic explosion. There's George Stephenson, inventor of the miner's safety lamp, personally descending into the most gas-filled, dangerous passage of mine to test his invention, while everyone else retreats to safety, holding his lamp steady in the explosive gas until flame simply fades out rather than igniting, proving his device works. Marden also gives us the courage of women, often overlooked in histories of bravery. Little Agnes Green, only 9 years old, keeping 5 younger children calm, fed, and safe through 3 days of blizzard in an isolated cottage while their parents, unbeknownst to them, had already perished on a mountain trying to reach home. Florence Nightingale, defying hospital officials to break open supply stores for her patients, declaring she'd take full responsibility herself. A Nebraska schoolteacher who held her freezing students in her arms one by one through a deadly blizzard until they died, then crawled, crippled for life, to a farmhouse at daybreak, while another teacher tied 13 children together with rope and led every single one of them safely through the storm. Marden draws a distinction here that's worth remembering. True courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about living so fully devoted to some higher purpose that personal danger simply becomes secondary. The truly courageous man, he says, isn't even observed to be brave. He does, as a matter of course, what other men would have to work themselves up to attempt. Chapter 8 is about self-control and opens almost comically with a husband and wife who both admit to hot tempers, but who've made one simple household rule: never be angry at the exact same time. Marden tells us about Roger Sherman, who calmly closed the blinds rather than confront a mischievous student who kept a mirror flashing sunlight into his eyes. About Aristides, asked to judge a dispute involving personal insults against himself, who simply says, "Tell me what injury he has done thee, for as I cause I am judging not my own." About Washington, overheard receiving a lengthy scolding from Martha through a thin wall, who says nothing in response except calmly when it's over. "Now, good sleep to you, my dear." There's a wonderful, almost funny anecdote about a young political candidate being taught the value of self-restraint. An older mentor deliberately insults him repeatedly, charging him $5 every time he loses his temper in response, until the young man learns, through sheer financial pain, to let insults simply roll past him. Marden makes a claim here that might sound strange at first. Nervous irritability, he says, is often the greatest weakness of character, the grit that grinds down the bearings of an entire human machine. He notes that profanity never once made a man richer, wiser, or happier, and shares the story of a ship captain who asked his crew, before taking command, to grant him one favor: permission to be the only one aboard allowed to swear, since he knew that if that door stayed shut for himself, the crew would never open it either. He gives us the story of Fabius Maximus, the Roman general who, facing the terrifying military genius Hannibal, adopted a policy the Romans mocked as cowardly, refusing to engage in open battle, harassing and delaying instead, absorbing criticism and ridicule for months, because he had the self-control to endure looking weak in order to actually be strong. When his impatient rival ignored this wisdom and rushed into battle, the result was a catastrophic Roman defeat at Cannae. Fabius's patient self-mastery, in the end, is what saved Rome. Chapter 9 broadens out into what Marden calls the school of life, the argument that our real education doesn't come from formal schooling at all, but from direct collision with the world. He tells the story of Samuel Drew, working late one night to make up for time wasted the previous day arguing politics, when a passing boy shouts through his keyhole, mocking him for working nights and wasting days. Drew is so struck, so almost frightened by this small taunt, that he treats it as a voice from heaven itself, drops his idle habits on the spot, and goes on to become a respected scholar and author. He describes how European merchant families traditionally sent their sons to work, unrecognized and without favoritism, in a rival's establishment rather than their own family business, specifically so the boy would have to earn his position honestly, learn genuinely new methods, and avoid being coddled by employees eager to please the boss's son. Marden argues that geography itself shapes character, that people raised among mountains tend toward cheerfulness, courage, and independence, forced from childhood to face real danger and difficulty, while those raised on flat, monotonous plains tend, statistically, toward melancholy and a more passive acceptance of whatever authority rules over them. He notes, almost as an aside, that tiny mountain of Scotland, with a fraction of Russia's population, produced a wildly disproportionate share of history's most eminent thinkers, writers, and leaders. He also gives real credit to newspapers as an underappreciated form of education, calling them the schoolmasters of the common people, while cautioning that skimming news without any real attention weakens memory just as surely as any other lazy habit. Above all, this chapter argues that industry itself, our daily labor, is the greatest schoolmaster of all, teaching patience, decision-making, and practical wisdom that no lecture hall could ever replicate. Chapter 10 confronts something Marden clearly feels strongly about: the difference between being and merely seeming. He opens with a satirical, almost comic sketch of a young woman returning from finishing school, so overloaded with pretentious, affected slang that her father finally puts his foot down, orders her upstairs to change into a plain calico dress, and declares that there will be no more rhythmic insanity allowed in his house. But underneath the humor is a serious point. Marden tells us that character lives inside a person, while reputation lives only outside them in the opinions of others, and that reputation, however carefully built, eventually crumbles unless real character stands behind it. The way vitality in a living tree shows up naturally in its steady growth of branch and leaf. He tells the striking story of a photographer who develops a portrait of a beautiful woman and is baffled by strange dark spots appearing on her face in the image. Though her skin looks flawless to the naked eye, the very next day, those exact spots become visible. She has smallpox and dies soon after. The camera's honest chemistry had caught what human eyes could not yet see. In just the same way, Marden argues, the first quiet corruption of an impure thought or a small deception may be invisible to everyone around us, but is already there, developing, waiting to surface. He reminds us that we cannot conceal shoddy work forever, that every rotten thread eventually stretches itself visibly across the whole fabric of a life. The chapter's real message is simple and sharp. Don't spend your energy managing what other people think of you. Spend it instead on actually becoming the person you'd want them to see. Chapter 11 is short, sharp, and to the point. Decide. Marden opens by praising Joan of Arc, arguing that her true power wasn't her visions or even her courage, but her decisiveness, her ability to see clearly what needed doing and move immediately to do it. Columbus succeeded, he says, for the same reason: a definite aim nursed since youth into an unshakable passion that refused to be talked out of itself by discouragement. He compares an aimless person to a ship without a rudder, drifting wherever wind and current happen to push it, sometimes landing safely by luck, but just as easily wrecking on rocks. He praises William Pitt, who became Prime Minister of England at 25, precisely because his entire childhood had been shaped single-mindedly around the expectation of great statesmanship, so that by the time other young men were still figuring out their direction, Pitt had none of that wasted time to make up. He tells us that Julius Caesar's crossing the Rubicon and his famous declaration afterward, "The die is cast," represents the same decisive spirit at the grandest scale, a single irreversible choice that changed the shape of world history. And he warns, using Hamlet as his example, that a mind capable of seeing every possible side of a question can become so thoroughly paralyzed by its own cleverness that it becomes incapable of acting at all. Sometimes, Marden argues, it's better to decide and occasionally be wrong than to never decide at all. A vacillating man, however brilliant, is always eventually pushed aside by the less brilliant man who simply knows what he wants and moves toward it. Chapter 12 is devoted to tenacity of purpose, and this may be the emotional heart of the entire book. Marden opens with a boy competing for a job, told to try hitting a target with a ball. He misses every throw on the first day, but comes back the next day having secretly practiced all night in a shed and hits the center every single time. He tells us about a young Sunday school teacher who refuses to give up on the worst boy in her class, Bob, even after he ruins 2 new suits of clothes given to him in good faith. Her persistence and the superintendent's eventually turns Bob into Robert Morrison, one of history's great missionary translators of the Bible into Chinese. He gives us Ulysses S. Grant as a boy already showing the qualities that would define his adult career: capable, self-reliant, quietly determined. What Marden calls a superstition that to retreat was fatal. He tells us that missionaries preach for 10, 15, even 17 years in places like Madagascar, Burma, China, and Tahiti without a single convert, mocked for their apparent failure. Yet those same regions eventually fill with thousands upon thousands of believers because the missionaries simply refuse to quit. He reminds us that the steam engine, the telegraph, and the modern locomotive were none of them invented in a single flash of genius, but were built up slowly through decades of failed experiments by multiple people, each adding one more piece until the whole finally worked. Dennis Papin and Thomas Newcomen stood on the very threshold of the steam engine, but it took James Watt's patient refinement to finally cross it. There's a striking, almost poetic passage here where Marden insists that failure is simply the final test of persistence, that it either crushes a life or solidifies it completely, and that the difference between a man who quits and the man who succeeds is often nothing more than one more attempt, one more night of practice, one more year of unglamorous effort that the world never sees until suddenly it does. Chapter 13 shifts gears entirely into something surprisingly modern: the art of keeping well. Marden shares story after story of remarkable longevity. Men and women who live past 90, past 100, past even 150, according to some historical claims, and looks to the pattern behind it. Again and again, the answer comes back to the same handful of principles: strict temperance, fresh air, cleanliness, regular exercise, calm nerves, and a refusal to let worry or anger take root. He tells us that Dr. DeBossy, still practicing medicine at 103 years old, credited his health to what he called consideration in all things, cleanliness, and a pure life, and declared that he believed becoming a centenarian was within reach of anyone. Marden is fascinated by how directly the mind governs the body. He tells us that sudden violent anger can actually change the chemical composition of saliva into something poisonous, that fear alone has killed people outright, that a single night of mental agony has been known to wreck an otherwise strong constitution completely. He warns that overworking the body without rest, as in the case of a young champion cyclist who died from riding through repeated exhaustion without recovery, poisons the system just as surely as any external toxin. But he also insists that a well-cultivated, disciplined mind can actually strengthen the body, that pure thoughts, high ideals, and generous purpose tend, on the whole, to lengthen life, while dissipation and vice shorten it. Health, character, and happiness, he argues, are really 3 strands of the very same rope, and pulling on any one of them inevitably affects the other 2. Chapter 14 turns to a subject Marden treats with real seriousness and no small amount of Victorian intensity: purity as power. He opens with General Grant, refusing to allow an off-color story to be told in front of him even when he's told no ladies are present, simply replying, "No, but there are gentlemen present." He tells us that Isaac Newton ended a close friendship the moment his companion told an impure story, refusing ever to associate with him again. Marden's argument here is essentially psychological. Before that word was common, He argues that thoughts, once entertained, cannot simply be erased, that the mind is like a photographic plate that permanently records whatever it exposed to, and that a single indulgent pure thought can resurface, unwanted, for the rest of a person's life. He tells us bluntly that vice and vigor have nothing whatsoever in common, that all wickedness, in Milton's words, is simply weakness dressed up to look like strength. He insists, and this was somewhat progressive for his era, that purity must be demanded equally of men and women, not just women, quoting a preacher who shocked his congregation by pointing out that a culture willing to punish infidelity harshly in wives while shrugging off in husbands has fundamentally corrupted its own moral standard. God, Marden insists, requires the same purity of men that society has always demanded of women. He closes with the image of a flower crushed, a heart broken, a light extinguished, things that can sometimes be repaired. But innocence, once lost, he warns, cannot be found again no matter how carefully it's searched for. Chapter 15 is warmer, more personal, devoted entirely to home and marriage. Marden urges every man, if he possibly can, to buy his own home rather than rent, arguing that ownership itself, the roses you plant, the porch that's genuinely yours, builds a kind of rootedness that no amount of luxury in a rented space can match. He tells us, through Jeremy Taylor's words, that marriage carries more safety than solitary life, that though it holds more burdens, those burdens are carried up by the combined strength of love and are, in truth, delightful rather than crushing. He shares a moving account of a poor woman, married to an invalid husband for 9 years, supporting her whole family by seating chairs, who explains with total clarity that she never regrets marrying purely for love rather than money or beauty, because money can vanish and beauty can fade, but love, real love, simply carries you through whatever comes. He gives real credit to the women behind great men, noting that Dwight Moody openly credited his wife as the true secret of his success and happiness. That Prince Bismarck declared plainly, "She it is who has made me what I am." He shares Theodore Parker's marriage resolutions, written on his own wedding day, promising never to scold, never look coldly at his wife, always to bear her burdens and overlook her small faults. Resolutions built entirely around a single word that, he says, sums up the whole matrimonial law: love. Marden also gives surprisingly practical advice here. That deception before marriage about your true self, your flaws included, only causes deeper shock and resentment after the wedding, and that honesty from the very beginning serves a couple far better than any carefully polished first impression. And that brings us to the final chapter, making the most of life, which functions almost as Marden's closing sermon for the entire book. He opens with the image of an artist taking a beautiful onyx stone marred by a streak of iron rust, and rather than trying to hide the flaw, carving the very figure of a goddess directly out of it, transforming the imperfection into the artwork's most striking feature. This, Marden says, is exactly what the successful person does with the raw, imperfect material of an ordinary life. He tells us about a merchant's family in Boston who lost everything in a business failure, and rather than collapse into despair, moved to a modest cottage where each daughter found honest, resourceful ways to contribute, teaching languages, selling fruit from the garden, sewing clothes for the family, until within 4 years the entire household was thriving again. He insists that every man's soul is like a gallery of paintings, and every single day we're handed a brush and told, quite simply, the canvas waits. What will you do with it? Every right effort adds beauty that will still be shining 1,000 years from now. Every wasted or careless stroke stays there too, forever, a permanent smudge we cannot erase, and start over from. He closes the entire book circling back to where he began: cheerfulness, hope, character, purpose, insisting that success measured only in dollars and reputation is a shallow, temporary thing, but success measured in a widening, deepening, ever more capable soul, that is the only kind of achievement truly worth chasing. Life, he says, is not mean. If it feels mean to you, it's because you've made it so. It was built by its creator to be grand, paved with diamonds, fringed with flowers, arched over with stars, and every single one of us is handed exactly the same invitation: to make of it whatever our character and our daily choices decide to build. So there it is, the full arc of Orison Swett Marden's Secret Achievement, a book written over 125 years ago, yet built almost entirely from ideas that feel strikingly relevant today. Cheerfulness as a discipline, not just a mood. Drudgery as the price every worthwhile skill demands. Honesty as a foundation beneath every lasting reputation. Habit as invisible architecture quietly shaping who we become. Attention to trifles as a hidden hinge on which enormous consequences swing. Courage and self-control as two sides of the very same coin. And underneath all of it, one relentless, patient idea: that character, not wealth, not fame, not talent alone, is the only achievement that actually endures. Marden didn't write this book for people who already had everything figured out. He wrote it for the blacksmith's apprentice, the discouraged clerk, the boy who thought his chances had already passed him by. His message, distilled into a single sentence, might be this: you already have, right now, in whatever ordinary circumstances surround you, everything you need to begin building something extraordinary. The only question is whether you'll pick up the chisel. If this deep dive into a forgotten classic gave you something worth carrying into your own week, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more of these hidden gems from history waiting to be uncovered together. Thank you for spending these hours with me, and I'll see you in the next one.